think it's very important because often when these attacks take place by mainly white racists, they're always presented as being the attack of individuals who are mentally ill or who have personal problems, rather than seeing them as part of a systemic process and seeing them as attacks on people of color and across the world in many different places. So I think it's important that we recognize that A, it's an Islamophobic attack because the killer made it very, very clear. He attacks a mosque, he kills people on Friday prayers, but also to understand that Islamophobia is a type of racism and it's linked to this kind of growth in what I would call sort of white nationalism. And you can see that, for example, recently in the Ukraine. On one hand, we're told this is a fight for universal rights and universal democracy, etc. And then you have students of color, students from Africa, students from India, from China, being taken off trains so white Ukrainians can go back when it's necessary or not. So this is why I think it's important that we call it what it is, which is a Islamophobic attack. I think it's really, really important that Muslim societies build this. Unless we remember that these attacks are connected, every single time it happens somewhere else. So once it was Christchurch, then it was in Canada, then it may be in, somewhere else. And we forget that these are not simply individual acts. There's a systematicity to them. These people, you can see from their websites, they share the same ideas. When people are oppressing Muslims, they do it in a way that people oppress Muslims. So there are some themes that keep coming up again and again. So, for example, what's happening with the Uyghurs in China? China talks about the terrorism, the threat from radicalization. The Indian government talks about the threat from radicalization when it takes away citizenship rights for Muslims. The Burmese make the similar kinds of the Muslims are coming to overpopulate us. The French government makes similar things. We are trying to stop the Muslim oppression of women. And then when you see what happened in Christchurch, you see all of these things condensed into that moment of violence. But that violence isn't just what happened. It's everything in the background which connects up with that. So if the Muslim communities throughout the world don't understand and build up this memory of these events, they will not learn anything from them. They will not be able to tell their children that these things occur. And more importantly, they will not be able to protect Muslims from those attacks. And this is something that's a heavy responsibility on all of us, that these while we speak, violence is being committed. And it's only by the grace of God that it's not us, but it could easily be us. And least we can do is not forget the victims of this violence of Islamophobia. It's not the appropriate response, because what it does is make us it internalizes Islamophobia rather than expelling Islamophobia. It's a rational response. If someone hits you, you normally think you must have done something to deserve that. But the problem with racism is that there's no rationality to it in that sense. It's not something that you have done. It is simply that you are. So when, for example, the Bosnians were being massacred, Bosnian Muslims were being massacred, many of them were not Muslims in a sense that they went to prayers or anything like that. They only became Muslims when the Serbian nationalists knocked on their door. I think it's very, very important to understand that the logic of racism isn't based on a kind of a reciprocity of any violence. The two most integrated communities in Europe in the last 100 years were probably the German Jews and Bosnian Muslims. And look what happened to them. It wasn't because they were violent, etc., etc. They were still not immune for that violence of racism. And Islamophobia is a form of racism. So yes, we always are told, well, this is in response to this act of terrorism. But look at what's happened here. And Europe is a very, very good example of what's happening in Ukraine. Politicians in Western Europe who were willing to rejoice in the sight of Syrian babies being killed, dying on the shore, saying that we should keep them out because they're not, while they were responsible for much of the bombing, which has led to the refugees, are giving free train tickets. The same politicians, not different politicians. So I think it's really, really important that the Muslim community needs to be educated in Islamophobia, like all communities. For example, in the United States, the African American community needed to be educated in racism because we have it in our heads, we experience it, but we cannot name it properly. And unless we name it properly, we can't actually see the problem. To allow us to see what this is, rather than fall back on these individualized solutions that, it must have been someone's fault. The people who were worshipping in Christchurch, what did they actually do to deserve to be killed? The person who killed them didn't know them. It wasn't like an anger that they'd stolen money from him or something like that. It was an act of violence at people at worship who were doing nothing wrong but worshipping God. If worshipping God for Muslims becomes a crime, then, what should we stop doing? So if the real point of Islamophobia is that Muslims should stop being Muslims, then let us be honest about that and say, if you remember in France, there was a huge effort that headscarves, Muslim students should be allowed to wear headscarves, okay? And after much struggle, the government passed legislation against headscarves. And you would say, that's fine because, people have different opinions on the hijab. Some people think it's not really necessary. It's a choice, whatever. And then the next thing is that now schools are arguing that Muslim students, their skirts are too long or there shouldn't be halal food. So the question isn't that there are these tick boxes that you stop. It just keeps changing. What is being targeted is expressions of Muslimness. And if you are willing to concede that expression of Muslimness, then you cease to be a Muslim. And if that's what the logic is, then if that's what you want to do, that's fine. But let's not pretend it's anything else. I think the declaration of something as Islamophobic is not the idea of being a victim. It's being an idea of a advocate for justice. The victim is someone who says, oh, it is terrible what is happening to me, and I can do nothing about it. But the point here is just to recognize what is happening and then fight against it. Because you can't tell me that this attack would not have happened to other worshippers in other parts of the world. Right? So it is not about being a victim. It is actually about stop being a victim. But when you stop being a victim, people want you to be a victim again. And that's the difference. This is why Islamophobia, the European Union just introduced a new document against all kinds of racism, in which it names racism and anti-Semitism, but doesn't talk about Islamophobia anymore. You have a government in France which bans organizations which campaign against Islamophobia and racism. And this is happening in France, not in China, not in Burma, not in India, in France, in Austria. So I think it's not about being victims. It is the idea that Muslims don't want to be victims, and they recognize that Islamophobia is what is victimizing, tries to turn them into victims. And they want the ending of Islamophobia. It is false to imagine Islamophobia only exists in non-Muslim societies. Some of the most accomplished Islamophobes are also those who would call themselves Muslims. And I think we need to recognize that. So look at the two countries which are the biggest supporters right now of Islamophobia in the world. One of them is UEA, directly supporting right-wing groups, Islamophobic groups, attacking organizations which fight against Islamophobia. So I think one of the things that the counter-revolution since the Arab Spring has demonstrated is that many regimes will do anything in their power, including becoming Islamophobes, to stay in power. Because ultimately the difference is the struggle against Islamophobia in Muslim societies is the struggle for freedom and justice. You cannot have a Muslim society which is Islamophobic and gives any kind of accountability to its people. And so therefore, let's not pretend that Islamophobia only occurs in places where Muslims are a minority. It occurs in places where Muslims are a majority, because what is being attacked is expressions of Muslimness. And that has been done, for example, historically in many societies, which were westernized by force. And among many elites, the idea of what is beautiful, what is valuable, what is progressive, all of that is completely contained in the idea of westernization. And what westernization presents itself as, to be Western, you have to stop being Muslim. I think what's going to happen more likely is that you'll find that historically, when there has been hostility towards Russia, it has been represented as being part of the Orient. I think that's more likely, that you may have an expanded notion of the Orient rather than one replacing the other. Is that there was a prediction that in time, the youth will become less attached to Islam. But what we've seen is the opposite of that. If you look at the last 40, 30 years, if you look within countries where Islam, the Muslim societies, or countries where non-Muslim societies, Muslims have actually become more assertive of their faith, of their identity, in all of these places. Where you go now to France or you go to London, you see, Muslim people being proud of being Muslim, but also being confident about their Muslimness. And this is to do with the youth.